Most people passed him by without a second glance. But one late night, someone finally noticed the janitor who never asked for praise, yet quietly held the building together. Elijah moved through the empty office hallways with practiced steps, the soft hum of his floor buffer echoing off the glass walls. It was nearly 10 p.m., and most employees had already gone home, their coffee mugs left half full beside glowing computer monitors set to sleep. The building was silent now, and in that silence, Elijah found peace. He liked the quiet. The world felt kinder when it wasn't rushing past him. He wiped down the break room counters, picked up a crumpled granola bar wrapper from under the conference table, and carefully realigned the chairs. He did this not because anyone would notice, but because it mattered to him. His father had told him once, "The way you do anything is the way you do everything." Elijah had taken that to heart. Every night, without fail, he gave the place the kind of attention few people thought it deserved. He never expected thank yous. Most of the staff barely acknowledged him during their busy days. A few nodded politely. Many didn't see him at all, but that was all right. Elijah wasn't here for recognition. He was here to do his job well, steady, reliable, invisible. Tonight, however, someone was still working upstairs. Charlotte Hale, the CEO, sat alone in her corner office, reviewing quarterly projections with tired eyes. She had built this company from the ground up, and though she carried herself with sharp efficiency, tonight she felt worn down. Numbers blurred. Deadlines loomed. She needed a break. She stood, stretched her legs, and wandered toward the windows overlooking the lower floors. That's when she saw him, a man in a faded gray uniform, moving from desk to desk, carefully collecting trash, straightening papers, and gently fixing a crooked picture frame someone had knocked askew. Something about his rhythm, the quiet dignity of it, pulled her in. Charlotte watched as Elijah took a rag from his cart and polished the glass on the entry doors, pausing to examine a scuff mark until it disappeared beneath his hand. She blinked. She had walked through those doors 1,000 times and never once thought about who kept them shining. Now, for reasons she couldn't explain, she couldn't stop watching. Charlotte stayed by the window longer than she meant to, arms crossed. As she watched the janitor she'd never really noticed before move through the heart of her building like it mattered to him. Like every hallway and corner carried weight. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, like he had a quiet checklist in his mind that no one else could see. When he spotted a chair in one of the glass conference rooms wobbling slightly, he didn't ignore it. He set his cart aside, knelt down, and inspected the base. Charlotte watched him tighten the bolts with a small multi-tool from his pocket, then test the chair's balance before leaving it perfectly aligned with the table. It struck her, he wasn't just cleaning. He was maintaining, protecting. Elijah moved on to a small break area, where someone had left a spilled trail of coffee leading from the counter to the trash. He crouched, wiping each stain away with practiced efficiency, then refilled the empty sugar jar and replaced the near-empty stack of napkins, without being asked. It was the kind of detail that got lost in the rush of daytime. But tonight, it stood out. Charlotte turned from the window and made her way down the stairs, her heels quieter than usual. She didn't want to interrupt him, at least not yet. She wasn't sure what she'd say if she did. By the time she reached the floor below, Elijah was in the large West Side conference room, a cavernous space where most staff meetings took place. It was empty now, chairs pushed back haphazardly, paper coffee cups and printed handouts still scattered across the table. He didn't hesitate. He cleared every surface, stacked the handouts neatly, tossed what was trash, and even gathered 2 pens that had rolled under the table. Then, with a quiet huff, he lifted the projector cord that had been dangling dangerously across the walkway and looped it properly through the cable hooks beneath the table. He was taking care of things no one ever told him to, things no one would know to thank him for. And Charlotte, standing in the dim hallway just outside the glass wall, felt something unexpected settle in her chest, something like shame. She ran this company. She built this space. But in all her years, she'd never once noticed the man who made sure it felt whole after everyone else had gone home. Tonight, that was going to change. The clock in the lobby ticked past 10 p.m., and Elijah wheeled his cart slowly back toward the supply closet. Most of the building had gone dark. Motion sensor lights dimmed to conserve energy. Another long shift behind him. Another quiet night spent caring for a place that rarely acknowledged his presence. He didn't mind, not really. This was his rhythm, and there was something steadying in being part of a world others didn't see. As he passed the hallway near the second-floor marketing wing, a muffled sound made him pause. Soft, frustrated, almost like someone trying not to cry. He stepped back and peeked through the cracked door of a smaller meeting room. A young woman sat alone at the far end of the table, laptop open, papers spread around her like a storm had hit. Her name tag was still clipped to her blouse. Sophie Lane, Junior Brand Associate. She wiped at her cheek quickly, hoping no one had seen. Elijah hesitated. This wasn't his business. His shift was technically over, but something tugged at him. He stepped inside quietly and cleared his throat. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Sophie Lane startled, then quickly shook her head. I'm fine. Just tired. Long day." Elijah didn't push. He moved a little closer, still keeping a respectful distance. "You look like you've been here longer than I have." She let out a humorless laugh. "Feels like it. I have a campaign draft due tomorrow morning. My manager wants it perfect, but I can't even get the structure right. Everyone else left hours ago." Elijah nodded slowly, looking over the mess of notes and design sketches. He wasn't a branding expert, but he knew what pressure looked like, what being left behind felt like. "You want some help?" he offered quietly. Sophie Lane blinked, confused. "You'd stay?" Elijah gave a small shrug. "I've stayed late for less important things. At least this one involves company survival," he added with a gentle grin. Sophie Lane smiled weakly, the first real one she'd managed in hours. "Sure, if you're okay with it." He pulled up a chair beside her. "Let's figure this out." He didn't know much about campaign strategy, but he helped organize her piles into manageable sections, asked the right questions, made coffee, and reminded her to breathe. He didn't need to understand marketing to offer what she really needed: presence, patience, and a quiet belief that she could do it. Neither of them noticed the faint reflection of Charlotte watching from a nearby glass corridor, her heart catching at the sight of a janitor choosing kindness when no one else was looking. The hours crept by slowly, the kind of quiet that only settled deep into the night. The office lights above hummed softly as Sophie Lane typed, stopped, deleted, and typed again. Elijah sat beside her with a calm stillness, sorting through sketches and notes, placing them into tidy piles that made the chaos feel just a bit more manageable. "I don't know how you're still awake," Sophie Lane said after a while, rubbing her temples. Elijah chuckled. "Night shifts have that effect. You learn to make peace with being tired." She leaned back in her chair, glancing at him. "You always work this late?" "Most nights," he replied. "I'm usually done by 10, but sometimes I stay longer to finish up." "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Does anyone even notice?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Probably not. But I notice. If I leave something half done, I think about it all night. Might as well just do it right the first time." Sophie Lane studied him for a second, then looked down. "You know, that's kind of admirable." He shrugged. "It's just work." "No," she said softly. "It's more than that." A comfortable silence settled between them as she continued editing her proposal. Every now and then, Elijah would point out a confusing sentence or help her pick between two image layouts. Not because he had any marketing experience, but because he knew how to look at something and see if it felt right. Eventually, Sophie Lane asked, "So how long have you been working here?" 8 years, Elijah replied. "Started as a temp contractor. Became full-time a year later." "Wow," she blinked. "And you've never switched jobs?" He shook his head. "I needed the stability. My son was starting high school, and my wife had just been diagnosed with a heart condition. Benefits here helped us through that." Sophie Lane's eyes softened. That must have been a lot. It was, he admitted, not with bitterness, but with quiet resolve. But you do what you have to for the people you love. She looked at him differently now, not as a janitor, but as a father, a husband, someone who had shouldered more than most would ever know, without once asking for recognition. I'm really glad you stayed tonight, she said sincerely. Elijah offered a small smile. So am I. Outside the room, beyond their reach, Charlotte stood watching through a gap in the glass. Her arms were folded tightly, but her expression was anything but cold. Something about that scene, a tired young employee finding her footing beside a man the world often overlooked, hit her harder than any boardroom speech ever had. The office was silent, but Charlotte remained awake, tucked away in a glass-walled conference room on the third floor. Her laptop screen cast a faint glow on her face, but her eyes weren't on the spreadsheets anymore. She hadn't touched them in over an hour. Instead, her attention was fixed on the hallway below. She had only come out for a moment, to stretch, to clear her head, when she saw them. Elijah and Sophie Lane, still working in that side room, heads bent close over a table littered with papers and notes. At first, she assumed they were just wrapping up. But as the minutes passed, she realized Elijah wasn't just tidying. He was helping, not in a performative way, not for credit. There was no audience, no one watching, except her, from her shadowed vantage point. She saw everything. The way Elijah listened patiently as Sophie Lane explained her campaign idea for the third time, her voice cracking with stress. The way he didn't interrupt or offer hollow reassurances, but simply nodded, asked thoughtful questions, and gently encouraged her forward. He didn't need to be there. His shift had ended long ago, but he hadn't walked away. Charlotte's chest tightened. She had spent years building this company, expanding offices, growing revenue. She'd sat in boardrooms with billionaires and inked deals that made headlines. But what she saw now, the janitor who chose compassion over clocking out, shook her in a way she hadn't expected. In silence, she slid into a seat by the window, her hand resting near her untouched coffee. She watched as Elijah gently took a stack of crumpled papers from Sophie Lane and began organizing them. His movements were calm and precise. He wasn't fast. He wasn't loud. But he was steady and present and kind. And that kindness, unspoken, uncelebrated, radiated more powerfully than any executive title ever could. Sophie Lane looked lighter now, still tired, but hopeful. And it wasn't because her presentation was finished. It was because someone had seen her struggle and didn't walk away. Charlotte leaned back slowly. The reflection of the quiet pair below mirrored faintly in the window glass. She had come in tonight thinking she would solve problems with numbers, strategies, and late-night planning. But here, in the quiet corners of her own company, she had just witnessed a different kind of leadership, one that asked for no title, no recognition, and no reward. And it was time the company recognized it anyway. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the office earlier than usual. Her mind wasn't on meetings or numbers. It was on Elijah. The image of him quietly helping Sophie Lane, long after his shift had ended, lingered with her like a song that refused to fade. She made her way straight to HR, bypassing the usual greetings, and knocked gently on the last door. Karen, the head of human resources. "Morning, Miss Hale," Karen said, surprised to see her so early. "Is everything all right?" "I need the personnel file for one of our janitorial staff," Charlotte replied, her tone polite but firm. "Elijah Brooks. Works nights at this location." Karen blinked. "Of course. Give me a moment." Within minutes, a thin paper file sat on Charlotte's desk upstairs. No thick folder. No commendations or disciplinary actions. Just a clean, quiet record, much like the man himself. She opened it and started reading. Attendance, perfect. Not a single late arrival. Not one sick day taken in over 3 years. Performance reviews, satisfactory across the board. Efficient, reliable, no complaints, no special recognition either. Salary barely above minimum wage. No raise in 38 months. Charlotte's stomach turned. There was a sticky note at the back of the file, handwritten and half-faded. Covers for others when needed. Reliable. Doesn't like attention. It was unsigned, but clearly written by a supervisor who had long since rotated out. She kept reading, and the quiet story of Elijah's character unfolded in short clip notes. He often covered weekend shifts for newer janitors who couldn't find childcare. He trained new hires, even though it wasn't in his job description. On holidays, he left handwritten notes for the morning crew, thanking them for what they did. Notes Charlotte had never seen, because no one ever thought to mention them. It wasn't that Elijah was invisible. It was that no one had ever looked closely enough to really see him. Charlotte set the file down slowly, her chest heavy. She'd built an empire where people could climb, shine, achieve, but she had missed the foundation. The ones who kept it all upright without fanfare or applause. And Elijah, he was the quiet pillar, holding more weight than anyone had realized until now. She reached for her phone and began dialing her assistant. "Clear my afternoon," she said, "and have facilities meet me in the break room in 20 minutes. She was done watching from the shadows. It was time to act. That evening, as the building began to empty and the sun dipped below the skyline, Elijah returned for another quiet shift. The familiar scent of disinfectant and fresh paper filled the halls. He moved with his usual rhythm, cartwheels softly squeaking as he passed each office, his motions efficient and practiced. Just another night. Just another cycle of invisible care. But tonight wasn't like the others. He had just finished restocking the supply closet when he heard a voice behind him. Calm, clear, familiar. "Elijah?" He turned, startled. Standing just outside the closet door was Charlotte Hale, dressed in a blazer, her sleeves rolled slightly at the cuffs. No assistant trailing behind her. He blinked, unsure if she was lost or had mistaken him for someone else. "Yes, ma'am." She smiled gently. "Do you have a few minutes?" Elijah looked at his cart, then back at her. "I can." She motioned toward the break room, and they walked together in silence. Elijah felt a knot of confusion tighten in his chest. CEOs didn't usually seek out janitors, especially not during the night shift. In the break room, she gestured for him to sit. He did, hesitantly, while she sat across from him, resting her hands on the table. "I saw what you did last night," she began, voice soft but steady, "with Sophie Lane." Elijah stiffened. Sorry. I didn't mean to overstep. She looked like she needed help, and I just—" "No," Charlotte interrupted gently. "You didn't overstep. You stepped up, and I want to thank you." He blinked, genuinely stunned. "I was just trying to help. And that's what makes it remarkable," she said. "You've worked here for 8 years, and I only just learned your name yesterday. That's my failure, not yours." Elijah looked down, unsure how to respond. "I read your file," Charlotte continued. "You've never been late, never called in sick. You train new hires, cover shifts, and never ask for anything in return." Elijah sat quietly for a moment, then shrugged. "Someone has to. I was raised to do things right, whether people notice or not. I've got a son. I want him to know that showing up matters, that doing good matters." Charlotte's expression softened, deeply moved. "I'd like to learn more about you," she said. "Not just as a janitor, but as someone this company has relied on far more than I ever realized." Elijah gave a small, uncertain smile. "I'm not much to talk about." "I think you are," Charlotte replied. "And it's time everyone else saw it too." The conference hall buzzed with chatter as employees from every department filled the rows. Once a month, Charlotte hosted these town halls, usually packed with slides, announcements, and strategy updates. People came mostly out of obligation. Today, though, something felt different. A quiet energy moved through the room, though no one could quite place why. Marcus stood near the back wall, as he always did when he was asked to attend. His uniform was neatly pressed, his posture straight. But his eyes flicked between the exit and the stage. He wasn't used to crowds. He definitely wasn't used to being invited to things like this. On stage, Charlotte stepped up to the podium, smiling warmly as the crowd settled. "Good morning, everyone," she began. "Today, I'd like to do something a little different." The room stilled. We often celebrate sales goals, new launches, and market wins, which are all important. But today, I want to tell you a story. A story that reminded me what truly holds this company together. She paused, scanning the audience. Last week, while many of us were home, one of our night shift employees stayed late. Not because he was asked, not because he was being paid extra, but because he saw someone struggling and chose to help. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't even know anyone was watching. But I was. She looked to the back of the room. "Elijah, would you come join me up here?" Every head turned. Elijah froze for a second, stunned, before someone gently nudged him forward. With slow steps, he walked toward the stage, confusion and humility etched into every line of his face. When he joined her, Charlotte smiled. "This is Elijah Reed," she said. "For 8 years, he's been the quiet force behind our clean offices, fixed furniture, and stocked supplies. He's trained teammates, covered shifts, and shown kindness when no one asked him to. And he never once asked for credit." Applause started low, then grew. It spread quickly, people rising to their feet. Managers, assistants, executives, all clapping for the man who had gone unseen for too long. "I'm proud to announce Elijah's promotion to facilities coordinator," Charlotte continued. "He'll oversee our entire building operations, with a well-earned raise and the resources to grow his team." Elijah's eyes shimmered. His voice caught in his throat. "But that's not all," Charlotte said. "Today we're launching the Brooks Initiative, a quarterly program to recognize unsung heroes in this company. People like Elijah, who lead through service, not spotlight." The applause returned, louder this time. Elijah stood beside her, overwhelmed, humbled, and quietly proud. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His actions had already spoken volumes. After the applause faded and the meeting ended, Elijah stepped off the stage quietly, his new name badge heavy in his hand. He didn't walk with a puffed chest or a proud grin, just a thoughtful stillness, as if he was still catching up to the weight of what had happened. People he'd never spoken to before stopped him in the halls that day. They shook his hand. They thanked him, not just for what he'd done for Sophie Lane, but for everything he'd done all along. The next night, a younger janitor named Noah approached him during shift change. "Hey, Elijah," he said, a little nervous. "Congrats, and thanks. You've helped me more than you know." Elijah smiled, clapped him gently on the shoulder, and replied simply, "Just keep showing up the right way. That's what matters." Word of Elijah's story traveled fast through the company. But it wasn't just the promotion or the applause people remembered. It was the way he'd helped. Quietly, with no expectation of reward. Something shifted. Department heads started checking in on night crew staff more regularly. A manager was seen helping clean out a supply closet, without fanfare. Someone from IT brought coffee to the janitorial team one morning, unprompted. The culture was changing, not by policy, but by example. In her corner office, Charlotte watched the slow ripple unfold. She saw employees lingering a bit longer to thank the cleaning staff, to greet the security guards, to recognize the invisible work happening around them. And in those small moments, she saw a company growing into something better. Late one evening, long after the last meeting ended, she found herself alone by the same glass window where she'd first seen Elijah polishing the entry doors. She smiled faintly, her reflection layered over the memory. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't held a title. But he had changed the heart of her company, more than any memo or corporate retreat ever had. She scribbled a note in her journal before leaving for the night, a reminder she never wanted to forget. Sometimes, the people who speak the least show us the most. In real leadership, it isn't about being seen. It's about seeing others. And in the quiet footsteps of a janitor who stayed late for someone else, Charlotte had learned what it truly meant to lead.